a talk by Maayan Keshev from UMass Amherst, and I am Meltzer from Tel Aviv University. Probably, maybe, when a grammatical structure is less likely than an error.
Hi, I'm Maayan Keshev, and I will present today work that I did as part of my PhD at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Meltzer-Asscher. So let's start. During everyday communication, many of the utterances we encountered are During everyday communication, many of the utterances we encounter are corrupted by production or perception errors. Yet most of the time, we do manage to recover the intended meaning that underlies this noisy input. And recent studies suggested that people do this kind of inferences using Bayesian inference or rational inference. So when they encounter a grammatically or semantically improbable sentence, its interpretation can be pulled toward a near neighbor that would render the sentence overall more probable. And they decide what counts as more probable based on two components of probability. One is the probability of different possible utterances that might be underlying the input, and this is based on knowledge of the language, world knowledge, and the current discourse. And the other component is the likelihood of each intended utterance to get transformed into the form of the perceived input due to noise. So, for example, Gibson and colleagues exhibited that readers switch semantic roles in implausible sentences depending on the type of editing that is required for that. So given an example like the mother gave the candle to the daughter, people may assume that the intended utterance was the mother gave the candle to the daughter, as daughters are more likely to receive gifts like candles than candles receiving daughters. And you can achieve this with a small addition of a preposition to the sentence. So the reader or listener ranks different underlying utterances based on the probability of each intended utterance, that is the high probability of daughters who receive gifts, and the extent of the discrepancy between the intended utterance and the input, which in this case is the addition of this short function word to. In the current study, we focused on the grammatical probability. So instead of using events that are unlikely to happen in the real world, like we had in the daughter candle example, here we test syntactic structures that are unlikely due to non-canonical word order, and infrequent sentence forms instead of infrequent sentence meanings. And we ask how rare a structure needs to be for readers to assume that it is a noisy version of another structure. And to do this, we examine the processing of Hebrew relative clauses, which are temporarily ambiguous between an object relative and a noisy subject relative. So let's see how that looks. In this example here, we have the beginning of a filler gap dependency. The student, which is the filler, the head of the relative clause, is plural, but the verb within the relative clause is singular. Now, we could resolve this by assuming that the mismatch is a result of some noise, some error targeting either the verb or the head noun, or, and in this case, the underlying structure would be a simple subject relative clause. In that case, we would expect the next word to present the object of the relative clause. However, we do have another possibility in Hebrew that would resolve this grammatically without assuming any errors in the input. So although Hebrew is mostly an SVO language, the subject may sometimes appear after the verb. And so we can take the mismatch between the noun and the verb to suggest that the student is not the subject of the verb no, but its object, and the next word should present this post-verbal subject. In the first two experiments, we tested this by looking at reading times at the post-verbal subject, and we are assuming that if readers form a structure where the students are the subjects in the subject position of the relative clause, they should be surprised to see a noun that lacks the accusative marker and cannot be integrated as the object of the verb. So we measure reading times using self-paced reading, which allows us to monitor the time it takes readers to take in each incoming word. And we compare reading times in these sentences where there's a mismatch between the filler and the verb to cases where they are in agreement, where assuming a subject gap does not require any noise inference, and to a baseline condition where there is no possible other subject, and so readers should expect the post-verbal subject already at the verb. And we want to see how readers react to those sentences with the mismatch and which strategy they use. If readers construct the subject relative reading, there should be high reading times on this post-verbal subject, and these reading times should align with those in the match condition, where readers don't have any reason to suspect that it's not a subject relative. But if readers prefer constructing the grammatical sentence, not assuming any errors, even though it has a very rare syntactic structure, reading times in the mismatch condition should align with the baseline condition where the post-verbal subject is expected. So let's look at the reading time pattern. Let's look first as a sanity check at the baseline and match conditions. So we observe increased reading times following the post-verbal subject, which confirms that readers construct the subject relative when there is agreement between the filler and the verb. Now, for the mismatch condition, we can see that there is, again, increased reading times at the post-verbal subject, which suggests that readers form the subject relative even though the verb mismatches the filler. We then did a second experiment to replicate these findings, and we found exactly the same pattern. So in these two experiments, we saw that readers need, readers need to choose between a sentence with a corrupted subject dependency and an object relative with a non-canonical word order, they prefer the more frequent one, even though it requires assuming a noisy input. In the next two experiments, we're going to take into account another option, which might provide a compromise between these two extreme alternatives. And this would allow a faithful analysis of the input, not assuming any errors, and a somewhat probable structure that has frequency in between these two options of subject relative and object relative with the post-verbal subject. And we're going to do that by using the other the other side of the mismatch. So if we have a singular filler and a plural verb, we again could assume that this is a corrupted subject relative, or we can use the impersonal null subject reading that is available with Hebrew plural verbs. And in this case, we would take the student to be the object of the dependency, meaning something like the student that people in the university know well. And impersonal null subjects are quite common in Hebrew, in contrast to the post-verbal construction, post-verbal subject construction that I just talked about. But we do know that object relatives are in general less frequent than subject relatives. So this version, this type of structure should still be less common than the simple subject relative analysis. So in the next two experiments, what we were looking for is reading times at the verb's object, and we're trying to see if readers construct an object relative in these kind of sentences. If readers use this null subject option to construct an object relative, a direct object noun should be surprising and create some processing disruption, because readers will need to reevaluate the sentence and change their interpretation. However, if readers still prefer the corrupt subject relative over the pristine reading of the sentence, like they did in the previous experiments, an object is predicted. Since you got your subject, you got your verb, and the next item should be a subject. Should be the object, sorry. So once again, we compare using self-based reading. We look at reading times in our mismatch condition relative to a match condition where a subject relative is grammatically possible without assuming any errors, and a baseline condition where there is no ambiguity. So the object should be expected on both match and baseline sentences. But in the mismatch case, it might be surprising if readers take the agreement mismatch to indicate that the sentence is actually an object relative. And this is indeed what we observe. We see increased reading times at the mismatch condition relative to baseline, but no increased reading times in the match conditions. This suggests that when the option of the impersonal null subject is available, readers construct this object dependency, although it is slightly less frequent than the subject dependency, and they do that to avoid assuming an error in the input. We then replicated this in another experiment and found exactly the same pattern. And so we saw so far evidence from reading times that readers prefer the corrupt subject relative reading over an extremely rare object relative, but they would still rather a pristine structure with an intermediate frequency over a very frequent one with a noise inference. So in the last experiment, what we wanted to do is to test both cases within one experiment and use a different paradigm for that. So what we did was conducting a sentence completion experiment where we had 4 conditions crossing the number agreement on the filler and the verb. And we used as a preamble sentences like the ones we used in the previous experiment, but truncated after the verb. We presented these word by word in rapid visual presentation, such that each word appears for a limited period of time in the center of the screen. And after reading this preamble, participants were asked to complete the to type in a completion for the sentence. We collected these completions and coded them as responses that provide a subject relative completion or an object relative completion. And let's look at the results. Here we will plot the results such that the y-axis here represents the rate of subject relatives out of all productions. So let's first look at the two conditions where the verb and the filler agree. So both are singular or both are plural. And this is kind of a sanity check, and we indeed see mostly subject relative completions here. Now we move to the first mismatch condition where the verb is singular and the noun is plural. In that case, only a post-verbal subject can allow readers to complete the sentence grammatically. And what we see is that our participants are actually producing subject relative completions. So they prefer, again, assuming a typo over using this post-verbal subject construction. And lastly, in the mismatch condition that had a plural verb, where a null impersonal subject is allowed, we see mostly object relative completions. So this replicates what we saw on the previous experiments. So in this case, people use the option of the impersonal null subject to create an object dependency which avoids assuming a typo existing in the input. This means that readers are willing to assume that the typo that the input contains a typo, but they only do that if the pristine alternative is very rare. So to wrap this up, our study demonstrates rational inference and rational noisy channel inference in Hebrew. We suggest that readers consider the possibility of errors when parsing sentences, but also apply elaborate knowledge of different possible structures and their distribution in the language. So readers are willing to compromise subject-verb agreement in some cases, but not in others, depending on the prior probability of the alternative analysis. This project was recently published in Cognitive Psychology, and we're currently working on follow-up studies aimed at manipulating the prior probability of the rare subject-verb inversion and the likelihood of errors, trying to manipulate within the experimental setting how likely these types of sentences or errors would be. Thank you.
Any questions for Maayan? While you collect your thoughts, I will. Oh, you have a question. You have questions. So, Elitzur, do you want
to? Yeah, I have maybe a general question. It's not about. That's something that it's your paper, but in general, when we think about Bayesian approach, how do we distinguish between two options? One option is that the listener is computing, okay, there was an error, and I prefer to assume that the other person made an error and I correct him or her, or that in the literature about predictive coding, the other option is that they make a prediction and they just don't observe the mistake because this is more likely that the other person said it, and without, like, so sometimes we just don't notice because we have prediction and the prediction are so strong, then we don't. So how do you make a distinction between these two options? You can tell me that you don't care, but this is something I'm worried in general about this literature.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think so. I think part of the idea is
just to clarify. So,
yes,
so
sure.
in other area, like in visual, when we have this, so we actually assume that when someone see a mistake, an illusion, so actually theory assumes that they actually see the other picture, which is not the reality. So that's what I have in mind.
Yes, so I think one of the things that makes one of the big components in this rational Bayesian inference is the noise component. So if you are just predicting something and you stick to it no matter what, it shouldn't matter to you if in general your input is more noisy or less noisy, or if there is a big discrepancy between your prediction and the actual input. But I think findings from this noisy channel framework suggest that this noise inference does have a big effect. So if you have, for example, in our experiments, we always have filler items. So people don't get used to seeing exactly the same pattern of sentence all the time. So if you use filler items that have typos in them, that this increases the noise inference that people make. So they might be more likely to pick this kind of to stick to their prediction. And I think that would be not expected if your prediction doesn't, if your model doesn't take into account some kind of noise inference. And that noise inference could be modeled within your prediction system. So it could be that your model say, okay, within context of high noise, you should predict more, or you should rely on your predictions more. But this is exactly, I think, the point of this Bayesian framework.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ted, do you want to ask a quick question?
Sure. Thanks, Maayan. Thanks for the talk. I think we're closer. Are you in Massachusetts also? I think you are. Okay.
Yeah. Same time zone.
So yeah, you showed nice effects there of people preferring a ungrammatical, like I guess a correction of an ungrammatical in the first experiments. And then you said it's like the noisy channel sort of predicted this effect, which I think that I kind of wanted to ask you about why it predicts it as opposed to it's consistent with it. I believe it's consistent with it, but is it like for it to predict it? I guess I want to know more about how you are going to figure. I guess in experiment 3 is sort of telling you part about this. How do you talk about the trade-off between the prior, which is these different expected, I mean, you're talking about grammatical prior here for the most part, and the possibility of some kind of error corrupting the input. And so how are you going to, like, I think it's just a little maybe premature to talk about predicting these models, predicting this as opposed to them being consistent with them. I think they're very reasonable, these kinds of models, obviously, but for it to predict it, I think you need to like have some idea of what the priors are and how they might trade off against them. So you need to work out what the noise model is. That's the possibility of the error. So how you I guess experiment 3 was a step forward in doing that because you were changing the likelihood of you're changing the priors basically, right? But so can you just talk about your framework, your program going forward for answering this question, if you can?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I agree. I mean, maybe probably saying that noisy channel predicts it, it's too strong currently. So I think initially my thoughts were, okay, so to get like to the real prediction of the noisy channel model, we need to really extract probabilities of these different structures and the different error types. And I think that requires a lot of work that could take a long time to do. So currently the direction I'm going to here is trying to manipulate within the experimental environment the likelihood of errors, so with like typos and the filler items, or the prior probability of the rare structure in the context. So for example, the subject-verb inversion usually appears in very high register in Hebrew. So I have an experiment on the way trying to have more high register lexical elements and other high register structures within the filler items of their experiment, and hoping to see whether this affects how you place your bets on these sentences. If readers change their prior probability within the experimental setting based on this high register.